Hey, I'm Pep, and this is a Pep Talk. Now today, we're going to talk about Rule Zero. If you've never heard this term before, or you've only heard it vaguely, it's a role-playing term, and it essentially refers to the idea that at the end of the day, no matter what the rules say, no matter what everyone's experience is, the person who is currently controlling the game, the dungeon master, the game master, whatever, makes the rules. This can often come across in one of two ways. If you're the players, you might see this as a little arrogant of the DM. Why do you get to change the rules? We bought these books have rules. We'll get into that later. The other way, of course, is the DM, who might see this as very freeing, relieving. Because at the end of the day, it means if you need to change something or want to change something, the players can't really judge you for it. Because the first rule is, you make the rules, right? Well, today we're going to talk about some positives of Rule Zero. We're going to talk about negatives too, but generally I want to talk to you about how to use Rule Zero. So yes, this is basically a pep talk for the DMs. Players can probably listen along. I don't think it's going to affect you too much. It might even inspire you to respect your DM's choices a little bit more. And of course, this can apply to other role-playing games. I'm not confident that other games specifically talk about Rule Zero, but the mentality really carries forward into other games. Now, I can't say it any better than the book itself does. So, before we go directly into using Rule Zero, I want to read a little bit in the 3.5 Dungeon Master Guide about changing the rules. Let's just go through these. So it talks about when you're altering the way things work, here are some questions to consider if you want to change a rule. First up, why am I changing this rule? Okay? I'll go through these point by point later. We'll get through all of them first. Next up, am I clear on how the rule that I'm going to change really works? Very important. Now, have I considered why the rule existed as it did in the first place? Kind of ties into the second one a little bit. How will the change impact other rules or situations? That's something a lot of people don't think about. Will the change favor one class, race, skill, or feat more than the others? And the last one is, overall, is this change going to make more players happy or unhappy? If the answer is happy, make sure the change isn't unbalancing. If the answer is unhappy, make sure the change is worth it. All right, so let's rewind and just start at the start. Why am I changing this rule? Rule Zero, and in essence, all of the rules in the rulebook are there to help you. The point is to have a stable system that is consistent and lets both the players and DM know exactly how things are going to work throughout the game. Consistency is probably the most key word out of all of that. If you want to change a rule to make things work more consistently for your group, to make things work better, that's fine, but the consistency part is key. If you're going to change something, it really should change across the board. If you say, have a world where you think elves should be cut off from magic. Well, that's a little strange. You might have a reasoning for it, but what you likely should do instead is make it so everyone is cut off from magic, with the exception of whoever isn't, if you know what I mean. And that's kind of a weird, broad example, but that's a lot of times why people use Rule Zero. They have a storytelling element they want to use, but some of the rules that are currently in place just don't work with it. And that's fine, but you need to consider whether or not it changes things drastically for the players. And really, in essence, storytelling is good, but in my opinion at least, most of your Rule Zero use should not necessarily just help the players, but should be in relation to the players. One of the classic examples is you run into a creature that is very much a troll. It's very obvious to all the players that it is a troll. But perhaps because of some special reason, this troll is not weak to fire. Spoilers if you didn't know that about trolls. Instead, perhaps they're weak to acid. Are regular trolls weak to acid anyway? It doesn't matter. The point is, you might change little things here and there in order to benefit the players. Now, it seems weird making something different. How's that benefiting the players? Well, it gives them a new experience. It gives them a situation where things aren't exactly always what they expect. But you need to be careful with that kind of thing. If you planned it ahead of time and this was a thing and you have a lore reason why this particular creature is the way it is, that's great. That's awesome, in fact. The players will probably question it and want to know more, and you can just hint that if they want to find out more, they should try to figure it out in game. Now, on the other hand, if your players run into a troll and immediately someone makes an intelligence check and decides, oh, I know what the troll is, I know its weakness is, and you just want to mess with the players and change it, that's not fun. You're really just using the idea of Rule 0 in order to purposely mess with or hurt your players. That's not really cool. So if we're talking about why are you changing the rule, well, just make sure you have a reason. Don't change it for no reason. Change it because you want it to accomplish something. Which will lead us into the next part. Are you clear on how the rule you change really works? Perhaps you don't like how flanking works in the games. You don't like that you essentially need to be on opposite sides. So you decide that if two of us stand side by side next to each other and there's an enemy in front of us, we're flanking that enemy. It's maybe not the best example because you do know in that case how the rule works, but maybe you know less about how it works from a number standpoint, from a mechanical standpoint. The bonus that you get isn't supposed to be easy, and that's kind of the point. I've often seen players look at a particular feat and say something like, you know, could you change this feat to work this way, or I don't like this, or this feat is way too powerful. And then you go and you read the feat and you realize they just didn't read it correctly. Maybe they completely missed a sentence, maybe they put some words where they weren't supposed to be, but they take something perhaps that means that you get a +1 bonus and they think it's a +1 bonus that continues to stack every time they do it infinitely. I don't know. There's lots of examples with players and with DMs where things happen like that. So if you're a DM and you read that feat that way, that it stacks, you might try to make some custom rule that makes it so that that's different. But that has nothing to do with whether or not that is powerful or not. It's just to do with you not reading it properly. Now, of course, this gets into rules as written versus rules as intended, and I really don't want to touch on that subject because that could take a long time. But what I will say is that if you come to the point where you're thinking about changing something simply because you think it's not good enough or that it's too good, use Google. We often have this thing in our heads where we think we're the smartest person in the world, or maybe not, but we think we're super creative and we're probably the first person to ever think of something. Most cases, you're wrong. If you use Google and you Google exactly what you're thinking, you will usually find someone else who's already thought of this, especially for a game that's been out for years. And then you'll see people who will correct them if they're wrong, people who will discuss it with them. You'll see solutions, possible ways that you can fix it if it does need to be fixed. Perhaps you'll see that it's already been commented on and fixed by the designers of the game. Either way, using a search engine is a really good tool so that you can figure out, one, if you're wrong, and two, if you're right, what a very balanced solution is. Everyone thinks that they can instantly balance something on the fly, but it does take a lot of work. The people who make these books don't just giggle and write things in and say like, oh, this is a fun rule, this will work. They put a lot of thought in, and often a lot of playtesting. So if you want to change something, make sure you understand it well enough. Look it up, see how it works. That's usually my go-to. If a player brings something up, either something that they want to take and they say they think it might be a little powerful, or they use something in combat and maybe you just let them do it the first time, you don't really think too much, and then you look it up later to be like, is that actually how that worked? You find out a lot of things on the internet. Now the next part was similar, and that is, have you considered why the rule existed as it did in the first place? All the same advice applies. If you're not sure, you can often look at the internet. You know what, I actually have a great example from Starfinder. One of the players mentioned that it seemed nonsensical. There was a feat that you could take that gave you weapon specialization. I won't get into exactly what it does, but the feat gave you weapon specialization in one weapon. And they said, this is absolute nonsense. Why would anyone take this feat? Now, the reason they said that was because when you hit level 3 in a character, any of the classes, you get weapon specialization for every weapon that you are proficient with from that class. Now that's where the sticky part is. It's from that class. So if you were to later take a feat or have something that gave you access to proficiency with a new kind of weapon, you wouldn't have weapon specialization with it because it wasn't part of your original class. That is why the feat is there. But the analytical mind sees something and just says, that's wrong, that shouldn't work that way. Well, it is right. It was designed that way on purpose. If the option wasn't there, you could literally never become specialized in something unless it's something you were trained with from the start. And again, there's lots of examples where this kind of thing can come up. But the point at the end of the day is that generally a rule is there for a reason. So trying to figure out that reason before you change it directly is a good idea. And the biggest reason for that is, as I talked about earlier, consistency. If you change one thing, sometimes that thing will come back to bite you. Let's say, for example, something like D&D. When you're hit with fire damage, unless otherwise stated, it does nothing. It does damage, it hurts you. But it doesn't specifically burn everything you're carrying. Your clothes don't ignite on fire. You yourself don't light on fire. There's a reason for that. 1, balancing, and 2, because a very quick burst of fire actually blows itself out. You can kind of look it up. It's how explosions work, but in general, a very large, quick blast will often put its own fire out because it's too fast, it's too quick, and there's air, there's concussive force, whatever. That being said, some spells specifically do say that it ignites combustibles in the area, and perhaps that it ignites things on your body if you were to fail a reflex save. Now, one of the most often cases for using Rule 0 that I've seen with newer DMs is to add realism to the game. They see something like the fire thing and think, that's dumb. That's dumb. I hit you with fire, you should burn, you should be on fire. Okay. Again, explain why that doesn't work, but understand where they're coming from a little bit. Now, let's say that they impose the rule that you're set on fire, maybe even it's quick, it's for 1 round afterwards, and it's only a d4 of damage. They insinuate the rule, instigate the rule, initiate the rule, that whenever you take fire damage, maybe you have to make a separate reflex save to see if your clothes burn, if any paper in your pocket burns. Maybe they just say if you fail your reflex save, everything burns. If you have any paper in your pockets, it's immediately destroyed. If you have any excessively flammable materials, they're instantly destroyed. Basically, unless something's protected, it's destroyed every time you're hit with fire. Maybe they say fire spreads. If you were to shoot fire at a tree, that tree will instantly catch on fire and become a hazard. Now, you may see where I'm going with this already, but if you haven't, this is absolute chaos, and it's not balanced. If you do that, you essentially would need to do that to all of the other elements to make sure that whatever effect you're getting from fire, you also get from other things in a different way. Otherwise, who would ever take anything that doesn't deal fire damage? Because now, on top of what you normally do, you instantly stop any wizards who had scrolls that they planned on using. You can just destroy parchment with barely a thought. Your enemy's clothes will be scorched every time you fight them, so they'll be easy to identify. Anytime you fight in a forest, it's going to turn into a forest fire. Not maybe, not possibly, it will. Any attack that misses has to hit something. And in a forest, what are the three options that it will probably hit? Grass, leaves, or wood. You've decided that all these things are flammable and will burst into flames. Well, congratulations, you cannot use fire in a forest anymore, unless you're also going to use water spells immediately after the fight to extinguish them. The way things work often work that way for a reason, and that's just one example. But that example, I want to roll right into the next part. How will that change impact other rules or situations? We already talked about that, how it unbalances things. But one of the big reasons that you have to be careful about this kind of thing is, let's say that you say that initial spell does that it will ignite things. Well, now the level 2 version of the spell that essentially does similar damage, but also ignites things, it's meaningless. Why would you ever use that? Why would you use something that does 2d8 damage as a second level spell when you could instead do something that does 1d8 damage and then ignites you for a d4 of damage in the next round as a first level spell? If you're not careful, you go into this deep rabbit hole where you essentially need to scale up every type of spell because you've made this rule. And you've given special abilities and perhaps even things like feats that normally you would have to spend a feat on, but now just get it for free. Quick Draw is a good example. It's in a lot of role-playing games, but it's essentially the ability to quickly pull out your weapon and fire. I've seen a lot of DMs just literally give that to players for free. And I get it, it's cool. People want to be able to the fastest gun in the West. But the thing is, if you just give it to people, then why did it even exist? Why is it that players have to spend an action pulling out a weapon? It's because that's how game balance works. That action spent to pull out a weapon makes it so that anyone who has multiple types of weapons, anyone who has weapons that they need to reload, all these things normally take up actions, and you're basically giving them free actions. And as I've said in any video about winning, having more actions usually helps you win things. So in D&D, not that you're trying to win, you're trying to have an experience, but that's the other point. I'm going to take a break in the middle and talk about this. A lot of times when people want to change things, it's because they want to win, quote unquote win. But what are you winning? Are you winning that one battle? Are you winning an ever-present war against your DM to see how much you can squeeze out of them and get extra things? I don't understand. The point is to tell a story, and having your character have weaknesses, have limitations, usually enhances that story, not detracts from it. The fact that you couldn't pull 3 knives out and attack with them all at the same time is important. Your character wasn't fast enough to do something. Maybe in the future, they look and invest in the quick draw feat because they need to be faster. They have to be able to do these things. Or maybe they do something different. Maybe they see their imperfections and decide to find a different way to attack, a way that requires to be less fast. Now, I'm kind of talking about the players a lot, and that's because players will often be the reason that DMs bring up Rule 0 and use it. Because players want something, and the DMs don't want to say no. I'm guilty of the same thing. If my player asks for something, my rule is essentially that at the end of the day, I want to be able to give that to you no matter what, so I will negotiate, but generally I'll just look and be like, well, that's what this feat does, so take that feat. They'll be like, well, I don't want to take it as a feat. It's like, well, it's here as a feat. I'm not just going to give you feats. I'm not just going to give you abilities, If it's part of the story, maybe, sure. I've had people infested with an ooze parasite that essentially gave them regeneration before. Of course, if they had ever got to below 1/4 hit points, which somehow they never did, it would immediately reject itself from their body and flee and put them to dying instantly. Okay, I'm just kind of rambling now, so I'm going to move on to the next part. And that was, will the change favor one class, race, skill, or feat more than others? The best part about all of these is that they all kind of roll together. As you start to talk about one, you tumbleweed down into an endless path of questioning the change. And that's good. If you try to make a change and you just start tumbling down into this never-ending, well, it won't work because of this and it won't work because of this, don't change it then. That is kind of the point. There's some things in the game that are very easy to change. Perhaps you change how you count experience because you want the game to go on a little longer. Perhaps you give more money than you normally would. These things are easy to change, and they do affect game mechanics quite a bit. People having too much money too early is often bad. People gaining levels too slowly can maybe make a game stale. But it's easier to change that kind of stuff without it affecting everything else. Because, as an example, let's say that you do give a player the quick draw feat essentially for free. You just say, yeah, you can do that. You can just do it anyway. Okay, neat. So whenever another player asks for it, of course, you'll say, why not? You gave that to the player who wields daggers, right? So yeah, they can have it too. Seems balanced. They both get it, right? Awesome. So the wizard also gets the quick draw feat and does what with it? This free thing that you gave to everybody, how does it benefit the wizard? It doesn't. It's not balanced. That's the point. The reason that you have these things that you normally need to essentially purchase, whether it's with skill points or with feats or whatever, is to have some semblance of balance. And the bit about it not affecting everybody equally is very important. One of the biggest defenses I will see a player make when they want something is, yeah, well, I'm not going to use it the way that you're talking about. Well, that doesn't really matter. You know, if you find a feat and it's worded a very specific way, and a player says, can you word it a different way so that I get this benefit from it? Or like, can we interpret it that way so I get this benefit? Okay, that's fine. Except if another player is going to take it, see what they're doing and say, oh, I'm going to do that too, but because of the way you're interpreting it, it means that I get to make 73 attacks a round. It's like, well, no, he's making one attack a round, which was why I was okay with him getting the extra D10 or whatever it was. But if you're going to be making 73 attacks a round, I can't let you have 73 D10 extra damage every round. That's insane. Now, of course, that example is crazy. That wouldn't happen. But that's how these things work. If you change something, you have to realize that that change will apply worldwide. Everything, everyone, including your NPCs and your monsters, have access to whatever that change is. Unless there's a very specific reason why they don't, and then it kind of just seems like you're favoring the players. Like a very specific player. And I kind of talked about something there, and I want to get into that. And that was about how things affect the NPCs as well, and the monsters. I've already been doing this quick draw thing, so let's say you did give quick draw to all the players for free. So now, why doesn't every monster also have quick draw? That means that every situation you encounter with the monsters, they don't have to have their weapons out and ready. They can just be sitting around doing nothing always. Second combat starts, boom, weapons in the hand, no action needed, and they can start the fight. That's scary. It's also something that came up with flanking. Flanking and the other thing is sniping. Those are the two that come up in combat a lot. Flanking being on opposite sides of the creature to grant yourself a bonus. And sniping where you essentially sit behind a wall and like shoot and then pull yourself back so that nothing can ever hit you essentially. Especially with new players, it's almost destiny that at some point one of them is going to ask you in order to snipe an enemy. It's like, well, if I just come out and shoot and come back, they can't hit me, right? Like, well, yes, that is true. But if they're going to do it a lot, well, I mean, the enemies are going to start doing it too. The enemies aren't stupid. But mechanically, it doesn't really work. That's not really how the action economy works. You need to come out, have a clear line of shot, fire, and then come back. Likely on a future round. And even if the way the rules are written let you do it, this is an example where Rule 0 can be important. You can say, I'm not going to let you pop in and out and attack things for free. And if they question it, it's very easy to just say, Because otherwise the enemies all need to start doing it too, and combat is going to devolve into nonsense. It's just going to be a ton of ready to actions used over and over to shoot at a person whenever they come out of hiding. And you'll just sit there in hiding and never shoot at each other, which ironically sounds like a lot of shootouts in movies anyway, so maybe if you want to have a very tense game, that would work. The other thing I was talking about with flanking, something often people have brought up to me is, well, if I'm standing here and you're standing there and we get a +2, well, if Finn stands there and Joe stands here and Sam stands there and Rihanna stands here, shouldn't we get like a +8 on our attacks because they're super distracted? Oh, careful with that one. Because you know what? That sounds reasonable. You're very distracted. You have a lot of people around you, so you should probably get stacking bonuses. But the thing is, remember again that that applies to creatures. So the second you accept that that's okay, every single time you're facing more creatures than your party number, anytime you're facing essentially swarms of anything, you lose. Like, almost period. Because they surround you, and they all have +8 on their attacks. It's one thing when a player has a +8 on their attack against a single enemy. Combat will probably end a little sooner because they hit. But when you have 8 enemies surrounding a player, especially if you have them all attacking at the same time, 8 things attacking with like a +8 each, that's probably all going to hit the person, and likely they're not going to be able to actually survive that kind of damage. And you might not think of that in the moment. And I understand. That's very reasonable. That situation I gave is actually something I did. I gave them that bonus, and then at some point, a couple wolves attacked them or something. And there's only 3 or 4 wolves, and then they had the bonuses, and the players were just like, oh man, this sucks that these things can like gang up on this. This isn't really fair. It just got me thinking, yeah, it really isn't fair. I shouldn't have let you do it in the first place. We just have to make this not a rule. Everyone just kind of nodded in agreement. Because at the end of the day, it's supposed to be fun. Like, balance is important, but you want it to be fun, and if anything is unbalanced, it tends to not be fun. If one player is just decimating the enemies because of advantages they have, because you agreed to a bunch of weird shenanigans, that doesn't really seem fun. I mean, it's probably fun for them, but you know what? That leads us into the last part. Is this change going to make more people happy or unhappy? And of course, is it balanced if everyone's happy? And is it maybe worth it if everyone's unhappy? And that's the thing. You want your players to be happy, and of course you yourself want to be happy, but balance is important in a game, and if when you change something it makes everyone unhappy, that might mean something. Is it worth it to make everyone unhappy just to change something a little bit? Maybe you want things to work a particular way in your world. Maybe healing spells don't heal immediately anymore. They have an effect where it essentially, if you have 12 points of healing thrown at you, you'll only heal 1 of it each round for the next 12 rounds. But the thing is, there are already spells that do healing that way. And on top of that, now players have to track things, and people just aren't going to want to be clerics if they think that they're not going to be able to actually be useful. So maybe none of the players, or most of the players, will just hate this idea. The fighter might not care because they'll think, oh, it doesn't really matter. Or they can apply some sort of a healing spell in advance and then maybe wander off into combat and slowly get healed. So they think, yeah, that sounds pretty good to me. But the majority of people probably aren't going to like it. So why are you changing it? And the other scale, if everyone's super excited to have something for free, there might be a reason why they're excited, because it's something they shouldn't have, and maybe they just don't realize it. When you're in the moment, a lot of times players just see a reward and think, this is great. But other times, you feel wrong. You feel like you shouldn't have this thing. At one point, fairly early on in a game, I was given an item. If you've ever heard of ring gates, kind of like Stargate kind of thing, actually. It's like little gates that you set up, and normally they're only about this big, so you can kind of like pass small objects through them. I was given a pair of human-sized ring gates. Now, normally those ring gates I talked about are like 500,000 gold or something ridiculous. They're very expensive. I don't exactly remember. So to take those and make them human scale, where it's essentially like a teleport gate that you can just set up and leave wherever, and an infinite number of people can go through, I said, no, this is too much. I'm going to immediately try to get rid of them. And I'm like, well, reasonably, my character wouldn't throw them away. So I'm like, how does this work in character? I sold them, and I used the money to give myself a few minor items, yes. But I also put it into buying a mansion, a base of operations for our party in Waterdeep. And that made for some very interesting stories. So I took an item that was probably too good for us to have and turned it into something that really benefited the whole party, and in a lot of ways it just gave the DM more ways to throw some story at us related to home invasion, something lurking in our basement, whatever. But players aren't always going to have that type of self-reflection. Sometimes you give them something and they're just going to be like, why not use it? I have it, right? But you know what? In retrospective, I think this video has been mostly negative, and if you sat through the whole thing and you're still here and you're thinking, at some point, I'm pretty sure he's going to say something positive about Rule 0. Well, I am. I'll do that right now, in this moment. Especially for new DMs, Rule 0 is what keeps you afloat. Because, A, you might not actually know the rules completely. So when you're put into a situation and someone asks you how something works, you have to give them an answer on the fly a lot of times. And so you want your answer to stick. So Rule 0, if I say that this is how flanking works in the moment, that's how it works. The beauty is you can always change it later. It is good to stay consistent as much as you can, but that's why the rules work that way. You're the person who hands out bonuses. You're the person who adjudicates the rules if people have a disagreement about how something works. And you can always go back and change it. So if you're a new DM, what you should see Rule 0 as is essentially a safety net. If you make a mistake, or if you don't know something in a moment, Rule 0 will save you. Because you can just say, this is how it works. We'll come back to it later maybe and discuss it, but for now, let's say it works this way. And if you need to figure out which way to lean on the side of fun. If you're not sure exactly how the rules work, lean on the side of fun. Worst case scenario, you correct something later and everyone just kind of laughs off like, oh, we would have totally died then. It's like, yeah, whatever. You know, you can just kind of roll with it. But for more experienced DMs, I think the most important part of Rule 0 is for world building. Because often you have your own custom world that you're trying to make, or maybe even just your own custom city or group of individuals or something. And you know what? If you look back at the history of D&D, some of the types of things that have popped up, these things were not part of the rules. The people who were playing the game had a very basic concept, and then they started expanding on things. They ran into a person that maybe had abilities that no one else had before. Maybe they were very special. And so that meant that now that kind of got put into canon and got to be introduced to everyone else. You can do the same thing with Rule 0. As long as you look at that list that I talked about and just try to make sure it doesn't completely decimate the other rules. And if it does, you know, affect a few other things, feel free to change those other things. But that is good. Using Rule 0 in order to essentially help yourself with world building is really good. Because people's first instinct is usually to create something different. What's the point in making a new world if it's the exact same as the world that the game is already set in? You want something to be different. Maybe you want an entirely new class of character where magic works a completely different way for them. Maybe you want a new class of fighter where the way that combat works is twisted a little bit for them. Maybe you're playing 3.5, but you really like the way that the advantage system works in 5th edition. And so you think, I want to find a way to pull that into 3.5. Well, balancing can be a little hard, but do it. If the players really enjoy it too, do it. And at the end of the day, if it doesn't work out, if you realize some reasons this shouldn't or can't work, then you can scrap it. And math is also your friend. If you really work it out, advantage gives you a +5. You're rolling 2 dice, and that works out to a +5. I haven't done the math in a long time, so that's just how I remember it. So you could just say that you give players the option that every time they hit +5, they can instead roll an extra dice along with their attack. It changes it from a static number to potentially a much higher roll. But something else really important is to talk to your players. They will often have lots of opinions on these kind of things. If you have an idea for a custom world that you want to use, or some custom magic system, or like I said, you want to introduce advantage into the game, talk to them. Make sure they're comfortable with it. If you had a certain game planned, maybe they didn't realize ahead of time that it was going to be quite so different, then they're going to be open likely with you about it, and they're going to talk about it and say what they like, what they don't like. People really love to have opinions too, so they might give you some ideas on how you can bring it in without making it too complicated. And that's going to be my final talking point on Rule 0. Is try not to make things more complicated with it. Again, people love to use realism as the reason for why they're adding a particular thing. But if you can keep it relatively simple, whatever change you're making, it's much, much harder for it to actually clash with something else, because it's not affecting a bunch of different things. It's really just affecting this one thing. And if you can simply make it thematic, do it. Sometimes people want to say like, oh, I have a character who uses lightning, but I want it to be like red lightning. Now, I know in some cases there might be feats that they give you bonuses related to it, all that kind of thing, but at the end of the day, if that's what they want, and they don't want any other bonuses because of it, they literally want it because they want them to have red lightning, just do it. Why not? It's thematic, it's fun, it's interesting. A lot of people actually interpret the rules that that's how it works anyway. If you are a warlock, your Eldritch Blasts are not just always these purple beams of energy. They're kind of something related to your theme, something related to whatever you worship, etc. So if you happen to be a sorcerer who is casting lightning spells, maybe your lightning spells are like that. If you have players start to push back and say, well, maybe people should get like a -2 on identifying my spells, just no. Just no. That's not the point. The point is that it's thematic, and if you want it to not be thematic, you need to take special abilities, feats, whatever, in order to do it. Okay, I said that was my last point, but I want to bring up prestidigitation. I mean, it's mostly D&D specific, but in a lot of games you have the same kind of spell. It's essentially the do little tricks for an hour or whatever that are things that like a normal magician would do. But because the spell can do so many things, people will often try to trick their DM into letting them use it for crazy reasons and to get insane results. But on top of that, sometimes the DMs will tell players that that's how it works and that they'll let those things happen. It's not how it works. You can't use something like prestidigitation in order to make noises to distract people in a way that would be mechanically detrimental to those characters. The reason why is because there's other spells, even of the same level, that exist that do that. So why would you ever have the spell Ghost Sound if you could just entirely duplicate it with prestidigitation? Why would you ever have Purify Food and Drink if you say that prestidigitation can do that too? To make these kind of arguments, sometimes it sounds mean, unfun, like you're just trying to drain the enjoyment out of the game. But the thing is, a lot of times if you pay attention to when the players are doing these things, they're often not doing it for fun or enjoyment. They're trying to see what the maximum potential they can pull out of you is. It's like, oh, you'll let me do that? Okay, I want to try doing this next. And it's not necessarily the players are trying to be spiteful either. It's a game. It's interesting. It's the same reason that people often use bugs and exploits in video games. It's not that they purposely want to just make the game less fun for everyone else. They just want to explore and see what they can do. So it's a good idea to use Rule 0 sparingly in those cases. Set up the boundaries and say, no, if something's going to change or something's going to work the way it's not going to work, we need to kind of work it out a little bit ahead of time. Make sure it's okay for everyone. So to sum up, Rule 0 is great. It's a really good DM tool, and it's a really good way to make your players respect the decisions that you make. A lot of players don't actually realize that Rule 0 exists. They don't realize that all of the rules in the game are there to be bent by the DM to make whatever fit, to make whatever work. The designers of the game themselves will often say this on social media. Someone will say, well, this doesn't work because of this rule, and they'll basically say, the rules can be changed if they need to be. They're there as a guide, as a tool. And like any tools, it should be used. Just be careful. Anyway, that's been my pep talk. Thanks for watching. I really want to hear if you have... I want to hear your opinions on Rule 0, but I really want to hear some situations where it's come up, where you've needed to change stuff, or you've needed to unchange things because you realized later that it just didn't work or that it broke too many other things. So give me your Rule 0 stories in the comments below. I really want to see them. Again, big thanks for watching. I'll see you later.